So it seems that in the recent balanced data slate, Games Workshop gave a lift to one of the more popular powerhouse Space Marine units. Let's talk about the Redemptor Dreadnought in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about one big stompy and angry walking coffin, and taking another look at the Redemptor Dreadnought now it just got a decent points decrease. In the video, let's talk briefly about the lore and models, then go through the Redemptor's datasheets, a few of the synergies it might have through the various chapters and options available to the Space Marines, and how I think about using it on the tabletop right now. In the lore, Dreadnoughts are one of the most iconic things in the Warhammer 40k setting. A great Space Marine hero is injured, and with some disturbing technology from the Apothecaries and the Tech Marines, they're interred alive into a sarcophagus, hooked up into a fighty walking tank with some massive firepower and brutal melee weapons, and roused occasionally from their slumber for duty eternal, being sent into battle as an unstoppable force, pairing some ancient Astartes experience with big armour and heavy firepower. The Redemptor Dreadnought itself was the first one that we saw of the Primaris era, bigger and more heavily armed and armoured than many of its peer dreadnoughts, but also with an unfortunate tendency to burn out the ensconced veteran, many dreadnought pilots not living long under the immense strain that it places upon them. In the Primaris age, we've since had the Brutalis and Ballistas Dreadnought come out as well, so both a dedicated melee and range variant, and the Redemptor itself got a pretty cool starring role in Space Marine 2. It was fun to see one in action with its Gatling cannon, first totaling 1,000 Suns Hellbrute, and then casting down a foul Helldrake, or stomping around and rather confusedly trying to find Magnus. I feel like there was one bit they absolutely nailed in that game. For a tabletop miniature, currently it's around £47 or $79 from Games Workshop, I guess shortly to increase in the upcoming price rises. At least in terms of points and excitement that you get on the board, it's maybe not one of the very worst Space Marine kits out there, around about 2.5 points per dollar, which is at least a little bit better than some. It has been in a fair few discount kits over the years, though not currently. It was a bit of a shame when the Dark Angels Combat Patrol box went away. For the model itself, as Primaris Space Marines go, it was pretty well received. A fairly nice and rather lethal looking update on the more standard boxy Dreadnought. I did think it was a fairly nice upscaling, trying to make the thing look a little bit more functional, but still preserve the same character. It's somewhat posable and has a fair few options, the main one being the big Macroplasma Incinerator versus the heavy Onslaught Gatling cannon, a few secondary weapon choices, and you can assemble it so it can be opened up to view the sarcophagus. Perhaps one criticism is lacking a little bit of chapter personality. I don't know if Games Workshop's going to go down the route of actually making some Dreadnoughts to theme different chapters, or the same for Chaos Hellbrutes at some stage. They haven't done for some time though. There are some creators out there that make some upgrade parts for them, such as Great Eye Studio. I did rather enjoy these two variants, which could work rather well for Space Wolves and Black Templars. I'll link them down in the video description. In any case, if you were looking to pick up a Redemptor Dreadnought in the near future, or any other Warhammer 40k things, I'll just give a quick shout out to the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. They stock Warhammer 40k kits at various different discounts around the world. Element Games in the UK has 15% off, Gap Games in Australia has around 21%, Friendless Workshop in Canada has 10%, Wargame Portal in the USA 15%, and Tash and Geldeep in Germany and the EU has 16%. If you buy anything through them, after clicking the links in the video description, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics, so a big thank you to anyone choosing to. I certainly recommend all of these on the customer service front as well, and they do a bunch of the normal things that you'd expect of discount retailers with things like reward point schemes and free shipping over certain thresholds. You can check them out, links below if you'd like to. In any case though, let's get on to the Redemptor's rules in game. And the main news that this guy's had is dropping down from 210 points to 195, really quite a solid points decrease of a big 7%. I certainly feel like that's enough to be meaningful, and we're going to see a fair few more of them on the table as a result. For that points cost, you get really quite a sturdy Dreadnought. 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 2+ save is an alright start, maybe not great for the near 200 points, but the thing that sets it apart is the -1 damage from Duty Eternal, so those wounds are quite a lot harder to take down than normal. The -1 damage is perhaps at its strongest around things like flat damage 2 or 3 weapons. It's half damage versus damage 2 like Plasma. Takes a third off the damage against damage 3. Though it's a bit less efficient elsewhere. Big hitting things like las cannons or anything heavier won't care quite so much. Normal damage 1 things or mortal wounds. And between the 2+ save and that rule, it means that it's rather indomitable to anything but mortal wounds and the hardest hitting anti-tank weapons. Obviously it does have a solid amount of damage, though I would say durability is maybe the single most standout thing, and big toughness just means that it works extra well with certain buffs. In particular, it's perhaps one of the most common Space Marine units to run with a Tech Marine, given that you just get outsized value out of the healing ability. Each wound is basically extra valuable to restore as it's so hard to take off in the first place. Not only do you need to get through a 2+ save, but the damage will have been decreased, so it's effectively more valuable than restoring your wounds to another vehicle elsewhere, such as say healing D3 on a Predator tank or a Ballistas Dreadnought. On top of that, it's quite a big investment vehicle at around 200 points, so it gets good efficiency from the +1 to hit as well. The 2+ save also means it's good for reactive defensive stratagems. Getting cover on it is pretty valuable if you're able to. An Armour of Contempt can really ruin the day of any sort of low to mid AP weapons trying to crack that sarcophagus, even if it does only affect for one phase. If you do have high stat saves with say a 2+ save in cover, and you're saving against las cannons on a 4+, it can also be reasonable enough to do command point rerolls on the saves if you are about to get hit by something with enormous damage. Besides the durability, you've got an 8-inch moving walker, stomping up the board with a whole bunch of firepower and then some melee damage. Out of the range of melee, I'd say that the range has a little bit more overall value. The melee could be good against certain very specific targets, though overall the range damage just has a bit more damage, and it's also a bit more valuable if you don't need to get right up close to deal it. Given that War Gear is free in 10th edition, you might as well always take the Icarus rocket pod, and then you've got 3 choices with the War Gear: Gatling Cannon versus Macroplasma Incinerator, Heavy Flamer versus Onslaught Gatling Cannon, and then Storm Bolters versus Fragstorm Grenades. For the big heavy-hitting primary weapons, the Macroplasma has typically been the one played in 10th edition. D6+1 shots at strength 9, AP -4 and damage 3 if you overcharge it, so really quite brutal against heavy infantry, and particularly if you get more shots with the blast keyword. Though I feel like Hazardous is a more legitimate downside for the Redemptor compared with other things, as 3 wounds of Redemptor is worth really quite a lot. A failed Hazardous test is almost 50 points worth of Redemptor destroyed in one go. There's one of the ones that you could genuinely be worth re-rolling the Hazardous if you happen to get unlucky. Otherwise, the option is the Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon. That's 12 shots at strength 6, AP 0, damage 1 and devastating wounds. It is going to do better against 1 wound infantry, though basically everything else the Macroplasma is better against. Even against standard Space Marines in the open with a 3+ save, the Macroplasma averages around about double the amount of wounds dealt. Between all that, it's not really hard to see why the Macroplasma gets preferred despite the risk. Then for the secondary weapons, the Icarus pod gets you D3 shots at strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2. It gets anti-fly 2+, a bit of a jack of all trades that might do something but usually not too reliably. For Heavy Flamer versus the regular Onslaught Gatling Cannon, most people would seem to be tempted by the regular Onslaught with 8 shots at strength 5, AP 0, damage 1 and devastating wounds. I think the range of 24 inches is a big advantage there as well. And then for the Fragstorm Grenades versus Storm Bolters, it's not ultimately the most important thing in the world. I think I'd probably be very slightly more tempted by Fragstorm than Storm Bolter, though there's really not much in it. The Fragstorm's got the potential to blast for some more attacks, though can't fire in melee. Between all the firepower though, the Redemptor is just a fairly easy dreadnought to use, unless you're rolling super poorly. If you do fire Macroplasma, Onslaught Gatling Cannon, Storm Bolters and Icarus all at the same target, there's a pretty good chance you deal at least some meaningful damage to basically everything in the game. Around about 8 dead Horde models, 4 dead standard Space Marines, 1 or 2 Terminators, or 6 wounds to a Rhino. It mainly falls down against really tough tanks that a lot of its weapons are wounding on a 5+. When firing it with so many different damage profiles, it makes sense to try and go for complete kills. So if say you've got some multi-wound infantry when there's 1 left on a wound or something, you might as well fire the 1 damage weapons first to try and take that down to pave the way for the bigger damage ones. For the core Codex Space Marines, I feel like the Redemptor was maybe one of the better users of the boosted Oath of Moment. As a vehicle that hits on a 3+ and doesn't have some inbuilt rerolls like the Ballistus, you're already going to get some fairly good value out of it, but mid-strength weapon profiles like the ones it has absolutely loves the +1 to wound to keep them relevant against tough stuff. It means against extra hard targets you deal around about double the damage per Redemptor fired at a thing. So say if you were taking aim at that Lamb Raider again, a single Redemptor would average around about 3 wounds before. The same one with Oath of Moment averages around about 7. That Plasma Incinerator hits so much better if it's wounding on a 4+ rather than a 5. As a result, particularly enjoying Oath of Moments, they might get on at least fairly well with having Guilliman in the same list, as there's a bit more chance you might be able to get Redemptors firing with Oath of Moment as opposed to needing it something else if you effectively get 2 copies. Then finally for its profile, it has melee damage, 5 attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3 with its Redemptor Fist. Basically a profile that's going to do some damage to basically everything, and it's quite nice at wounding toughness 10 tanks, but at the same time it's almost never going to be outright wiping units out, maybe squashing a Terminator or 2, or doing something like 3 or 6 wounds to a toughness 10 vehicle. Tank shock certainly could be an option though if you want to try and do a bit more. Combined with that damage, an extra 3 mortal wounds or so might just tip it over the edge, where you can wipe out a good portion of the enemy unit and not have to worry quite so much about the hit back in return. Overall, the Redemptor's got lots of interesting things going for it. Really quite standout durability, particularly now it doesn't cost quite so much per wound. Quite nice general purpose range damage and some melee, and takes certain buffs well like the Tech Marine or Oath of Moment. It overall makes it quite an easy to use unit, just stomp it up to the midboard and force the opponent to deal with it. That does have the downsides that just compared with other tanks out there, it's not going to have quite as much hitting power. and there will be some weapons that are just disturbingly effective against it, usually the ones with really big damage like say Tyrannid Tyrannifexes, Tau Railguns or Enemy Gladiator Lancers. It does pay a bit of a premium for being a generalist, and often has tended to see maybe a little bit more playing casual games versus competitive as a result. For buffs and things that you can put on it, I've already talked about a few. Obviously there's all the other Space Marine firepower style buffs, things like Combi Lieutenants, Incursors to mark targets and Storm Speeders and things. They're going to have some pretty good synergy, and a Redemptor unit that they could buff well. The Incursors are going to be less used if it's buffed by a Tech Marine though, and the Storm Speeders might vary a bit depending on the army. If you're playing a Redemptor not in Core Codex Space Marines, then the Thunder Strike could be more interesting for the +1 to wound. The Hammer Strike's nice for stripping cover though. For some of the main ways that you could buff Redemptor Dreadnoughts though, Ironstorm Spearhead is often one of the places where they've had their best home. It's the Space Marine vehicle support detachment, so it's likely to have better things for these than elsewhere. The re-rolling a single dice for the Macroplasma Incinerator adds some nice extra efficiency, and it works well with the melee as well. If you can fork out the big command point thing for the critical hits on a 5+, and maybe stack with the lethal hits as well, you can have a ridiculously brutal shooting phase. That does require lots of investment though, so it isn't necessarily auto-include even here. But it's just generally good stratagem support, a big walker buff one, a nice return fire one when you're reduced to half health, and an auto-explode for D3 mortal wounds. It'll really quite enjoy the Tech Marine enhancements, including cancelling a damage. That's going to be super bad news for an opponent actually trying to take it off the board, particularly when that's going to be so good against the exact sort of damage that you'd usually want to try and hit this thing with. Otherwise, a bunch of the other detachments also have some things. Gladius Task Force is maybe the other most standout one, just being very general purpose. It is somewhat slow, so it certainly gets good value out of Advance and Shoot and Advance and Charge, and some of the other stratagems could be okay situationally. Firestorm, I guess Assault and +1 to Strength up close is handy enough, and Vanguard Spearhead might not do much for it stratagem wise, but could make it weirdly tankier at longer range. The others maybe add a bit in theory land, though don't really feel like particularly great fits. For chapter synergies, at least between the various different detachments and units they have, most chapters at least have something that could help out the Redemptor. Whether or not it's actually a good idea to try and use those synergies might be another thing though. Gilliman for the Ultramarines isn't the worst match in the world. As mentioned, his double oath of moment could be pretty handy to give it more chance for the Redemptors to actually be able to use it. They could be an unusual and quite efficient target for free stratagems as well nearby. Otherwise, for the core codex, it's maybe Ironfather Phyros of the Iron Hands that might be best suited. He gets 3 wound repairs from his base ability, so basically a Tech Marine plus, and as mentioned, they get on really well with those in the first place. Having a Redemptor Dreadnought and then Ironfather Phyros moving up with a heavy intercessor bodyguard seems like a pretty intimidating tanky battle line to be dealing with. Otherwise, for the more divergent chapters, they haven't tended to be a particularly central unit. The most could offer something. The Blood Angels could hit abnormally hard in melee with +1 attack and strength 14 with their Liberator Assault group. I feel like they don't really get the most out of those assault buffs compared with other units though. The Dark Angels could maybe pair with a Landspeeder Dark Shroud, or you can make Dreadnought shoot fairly hard in the Lion's Blade Task Force, though it's not one of the more commonly played ones. Black Templars have a smash through wall stratagem with their Godhammer Transport detachment that could genuinely be handy enough to get a Redemptor where it needs to be. The Deathwatch don't have too much in Black Spear, though I guess could benefit from the Tome of Ectoclades for some rerolls. I feel like perhaps out of the divergent chapters, the Space Wolf Saga of the Beast Slayer could be one of the better ones. That gets you lethal hits at long range against tough stuff like monsters and vehicles, and in general that's exactly what that Macroplasma needs, and makes them far more relevant and threatening against monsters and vehicles. Finally, for a more unusual way to play the Redemptor, it can also be transported in a Stormraven gunship. Games Workshop have repeatedly put up the points cost of these up to 280, so they're not super efficient, but it does seem that every so often one turns up doing well in tournaments in one way or another. With the Dark Angel's Dark Shroud having dropped down to 100 points now, making a big threatening play could be a bit more interesting than it was before. Having 2 very threatening vehicles with -1 to hit and cover, plus their -1 damage debuffs, and then you can throw Armour of Contempt into the mix on whichever one the opponent tries to focus down. With a 20-inch move plus the Dreadnought's Disembark, you can have really quite a big shooting alpha strike there, lightly buffed up by Oath of Moment. It really is a big all-in strategy though. And if they go for the wrong thing, or the opponent is just able to counter-attack very successfully, you could lose loads of points. Prior to the points changes, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at how much they were used in competitive armies. I wasn't really expecting too many to be cropping up in top placing lists, and after a quick look through 10 high placing Space Marine lists, it seems that only one of those used a single Redemptor, which was in Ultramarines Gladius, even if they can obviously do well in Ironstorm as well. It seems that it's fairly similar for other Grand Tournament lists. Take a look at Stats Hutbut's site, it seems that around about 1 out of 10 lists choose to take a Redemptor, far behind other staples like the Ballista's Dreadnought, which was seeing loads of play, cropping up in 7 out of 10 lists. It was my instinct that 210 points was a bit steep. Definitely still a powerful and fairly easy unit to use, but paying a bit much for what it did, given a fairly low damage output. I feel like with 15 points off down to 195 points though, I feel like it could well be set to make a comeback. In particular, the Ballistus Dreadnought lost a lot of ground against this guy. In the last update, the Ballistus went up by 10 points, the Redemptor down by 15, and now it's just a 45 points for the upgrade for the trade in firepower plus some melee damage, and of course the big -1 damage rule. There's certainly plenty of other rivals for Space Marine armor damage dealing though. The other most played big tank damage dealer has been the Repulsor Executioner, Vindicator, and Gladiator Lancer. They didn't go up in cost, but maybe the Redemptor Dreadnought might be efficient enough to sort of join them as another solid option now, as opposed to being a bit inferior. In any case, putting it together for how I'd be tempted to field them in game, I would still be going for the Macroplasma Incinerator, the Onslaught Gatling Cannon, and then no real preference between Storm Bolters and the Fragstorm Grenades. I feel like you absolutely could just run the one of them and just send it up towards an objective to have a very tanky thing for the opponent to deal with, though running multiple also seems fine, as it means that you could better justify a Tech Marine, and you're likely to thoroughly overload your opponent's anti-tank damage. For support options, I think the Tech Marine is fine, though not necessarily 100% needed. I wouldn't pair one with just a single Redemptor unless he's got some other things as an option to support it in case it got taken out. Armour of Contempt's going to be a solid option for him, as is Tank Shock potentially. I certainly rate him as having excess value in Ironstorm, though Gladius has at least some support, and just in general does have enough overall threats for just most damage and defensive stratagems that you could use on him. Obviously game plans might depend a bit on the opponent, particularly whether or not they genuinely have enough anti-tank to take him out at range, though I feel like compared with most of the Space Marine army he's going to be tankier than the majority of things, and as a result probably wants to be at least somewhere towards the front lines, perhaps moving up just a little bit cautiously and towing behind cover so that the opponent's going to be met with a 2+ save with a +1, making sure that he's firing as many turns as possible, and perhaps ideally being one of the further things forward, so the opponent is actually going to have to try and crack through that big defensive profile, as opposed to just ignoring him with a few turns, which could be a danger if he's just sitting back shooting. If the opponent gets too close, then he can push forward and do a round of shooting and then also follow up with a charge as well, and hopefully over several turns we'll be grinding down at the opponent's army with weapon profiles that could both threaten light hordes and things or big tough stuff. If you did have multiple and the opponent's got some big targets to shoot at, Oath of the Moment does feel pretty nice on those Macroplasma Incinerators. Multiple of those with re-rolling all hits and a +1 to wound, it's going to be hugely threatening to even the toughest stuff in the game. Overall though, seems like a nice boost to the Redemptor. Let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments below. Would you be tempted to put the mainline Primaris Dreadnought back on the table? I'll leave that there for this one. As mentioned, if you did want to support the channel and happen to be buying in any Warhammer things in the near future, check out the affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description. They save a fair bit of money versus Games Workshop, and if you use the links in the video description, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics as well. As ever, a big thank you to people using those. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I certainly tend to keep the Warhammer 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel more directly, I do have a Patreon page as well. That's linked down in the video description, and has a few advantages such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.